Veterans of Vietnam have had a great many complaints about the government agency that is supposed to serve them after they stop serving us. That government agency is the Veterans Administration. Tonight, John Johnson and his Target 7 investigative unit begin a week-long series telling us what is wrong with the VA. John?
Thank you, Bill. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed the executive order creating the Veterans Administration as a separate independent agency of government, charged with coordinating government activities affecting all war veterans. Over 50 years later, serious questions have been raised about the Veterans Administration as an institution that has never been investigated by an outside agency. The Veterans Administration investigates itself. $24 billion a year of your tax dollar goes to the VA. Target 7, after numerous complaints against the VA by war veterans, decided to take a look at the Veterans Administration, called by the New England Journal of Medicine a sacred cow of government. The job of the VA. What is the general philosophy?
The philosophy, of course, is expressed in that old statement of Lincoln's that is repeated over and over, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, for his widow and for his orphan.
Fog it. Oh. Here. Pat, wait up on it. Oh, my leg. Come on, Pat. Oh, 79 went off my face.
To care for him who has borne the battle, for his widow and his orphan. The credo of the Veterans Administration, a covenant between the government and the men and women who have served this nation, the hundreds of thousands who have died, the hundreds of thousands who have been wounded, physically and mentally, fighting for freedom, for dawn's early light.
I've gone to the Northport Hospital, went down there bleeding like a stuffed pig and walked in the door at 8 o'clock in the morning. And sat there for 6 hours before they even looked at me and told me that they wouldn't take me in the hospital. And I said, why not? He said, because we don't have any room. And I told the guy, and I told the story there. I was treated in the field. Treat me in the bathroom. Lay a blanket down in the bathroom and do what you got to do in there. But you can't send me out of this hospital this way. I'm bleeding like a pig. I need an operation. You got to do something. They said, we're sorry. Why don't you go to a private hospital? I said, the sign out there, man, says Veterans Hospital. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I served 13 months over there. I mean, I got some rights.
Eddie Blatt is only one of the thousands of veterans who no longer believe in the Veterans Administration. He and others like him are bitter and angry, most of them Vietnam veterans. They say the VA never lived up to the covenant between the government and its fighting men, that covenant being care for the veteran, a right they have earned.
Since the Vietnam War began, quality of care and management and concern within the Veterans Administration has deteriorated. Today, most of the veterans' hospitals, and I categorically indict most of them, are worse than the average community hospital, and certainly not up to the quality of tertiary care you would expect at a hospital funded to the level of budget that the VA's hospitals are.
It is one of the largest budgets in the nation, more than $24 billion a year. It is the biggest welfare agency in Washington. While the VA and others in the administration shy away from the term welfare agency, the VA's services would meet any economist's definition of income transfers. Well over half of the agency's $23 billion 1981 budget supports pensions and compensation for disabled war veterans and their survivors. Billions more are being spent to provide free or low-cost medical care to veterans and their dependents. A gigantic bureaucracy that Target 7 has found doesn't always fulfill its credo and often misses the mark in providing adequate medical care to the veterans. According to this landmark study of the Veterans Administration by the National Academy of Sciences, it was recommended that the Veterans Administration hospitals ultimately be merged into community-based facilities. This due in part to poor medical care, especially in the areas of surgery, psychiatry, prosthetics, and incorrect prescribing of drugs. The study is also highly critical of understaffing and inadequate supplies at the VA hospitals. For 2 months of Target 7's 3-month-long undercover investigation of the Veterans Administration, 2 Target 7 investigators worked as volunteers in the Bronx and Manhattan VA hospitals, using on-hand observations, daily logs, photographs, and a hidden camera, documented what appeared to be case after case of questionable medical and physical care of the patients, a system too often with insensitive tendencies, and at best bogged down in red tape, and at worst, apparently incompetent. Target 7 also visited the Brooklyn VA hospital, and through contacts in Washington and staff members at the Brooklyn VA, we found Peter Sabia, a Vietnam veteran. Peter Sabia's documented case typifies the problems that exist in the Veterans Administration and the 172 hospitals run by the VA.
When I first went to the VA hospital, I was diagnosed as having venereal disease.
You were treated for having a venereal disease. What then happened after being treated for a month for venereal disease?
Well, I went back to the hospital, to the Brooklyn VA, having had no satisfaction, and things weren't getting any better. The pain was very unbearable. I went back to the VA, and they decided to run further tests, where I was admitted to the hospital, and they opened me up and found out that's when I had cancer. That's when they discovered that it was cancer and not a venereal disease.
You're telling me that you were treated for a month or more at the Brooklyn Veterans Hospital for venereal disease when indeed you had terminal testicular cancer?
That's correct, right.
Have you been able to get any kind of monetary assistance from the Veterans Administration?
No, I haven't been able to. I've put in multiple claims with the Veterans Administration and through the National Institute of Health in Washington, and I still haven't been able to get any kind of a disability or pension.
You haven't been able to get any disability?
No, I haven't.
Well, why do you think that is?
My wife is employed, and she makes over a certain amount of money a year, and they told me that as long as my wife worked, my wife was capable of supporting me.
Celia, with the money that you're making, can you support Samantha, Peter, the medical bills and all of that?
No.
Do you need help?
Definitely do.
You definitely
Definitely. It's impossible. Just can't make ends meet anymore.
10 days after we interviewed Peter Sabia and his wife, the Veterans Administration sent Sabia a mailgram confirming that he would be given disability benefits. It had taken more than 2 years from the time the VA told Sabia that he had testicular cancer and had 6 to 9 months to live before he received any disability compensation. In order to get those disability benefits, Peter was forced to leave his wife and 4-year-old daughter.
Apparently, that's the way it comes down. I was entitled to this money all along, but because I was living with my wife and my wife worked, well, that kind of just canceled one another out. Hopefully now that I have some kind of money and all, I'd like to try to get back together with my wife with a normal life. But then if I do, and I notify the Veterans Administration that I am living with my wife, apparently this disability is only good while I'm incapable of making a living. If my wife were to come back and we were to live together again as man and wife, they would probably take my disability away.
So Peter Sabia has his disability pension, but he had to give up his family to get it. A hollow victory for a young man who fought for his country. Tomorrow, Target 7 takes you undercover inside a VA hospital right here in New York. Roger.
Long after they finished reading the American Army newspaper, Stars and Stripes, American soldiers very often depend upon the Veterans Administration for their health care. But sometimes getting that health care is a whole new battle they have to fight. That's what John Johnson has been looking into with his Target 7 investigative unit as he continues his report tonight. John?
Thank you, Bill. The Veterans Administration, one of the largest agencies of government, a $24 billion a year budget, over 250,000 employees, all this to provide care for those who have served the country, the veteran. A recent survey conducted by the VA itself claims that 80% of the veterans in the survey gave the VA high marks for its health care. After a 3-month-long undercover investigation of the Veterans Administration, Target 7 found some other veterans not at all happy with the VA medical care. In fact, some calling it enemy territory.
I'd fight for my country, but I won't go to a VA hospital. And if any other veteran asked me to go, I wouldn't recommend it. If they had the money, go somewhere else. Because they do treat you like an animal.
The Veterans Administration as an institution is the most dangerous enemy of the Vietnam combat veteran since they left the Viet Cong in the jungle.
It was in the jungles of Vietnam that much of the criticism of the Veterans Administration and its health care was seeded. Almost 3 million American men and women served in Vietnam. More than 100,000 died. Hundreds of thousands were wounded. There are over 600,000 Vietnam veterans living in New York State alone. Those who returned have had the hardest readjustment back into society than any other previous war veterans. Many came back physically and emotionally scarred. They came back from that unpopular war to Veteran Administration hospitals they say were insensitive to their needs and lacking in proper medical treatment.
I refused to go to VA hospital because, as far as I was concerned, that was enemy territory.
I'd say the treatment could have been better. It's bordering on negligence.
Show me the person that's making the complaint, and I can show you a lot of people that are very happy with their care. Now, I believe we deliver outstanding care to those.
The Manhattan VA, just behind me, is but one of 172 Veterans Administration hospitals around this country. This hospital is a kind of medical mecca of the 80s, boasting high technology and treating over 14,000 patients a year. But behind the facade of medical technology and the patient load, there is another story. In order to get at that story, Target 7 went undercover. And what we found had little to do with the state-of-the-art medical technology, but rather the lack of human care. For 2 months, a Target 7 investigator worked as a volunteer at the Manhattan VA. Using a daily diary, photographs, and a hidden camera, made these observations. November 18, 1981. A male patient on the ward is treated in the hallway on a portable bed. At one point, the nurse began inserting tubes into his rectum in the open hallway, while the patient screamed, "Someone help me, help me." December 2nd and December 18th, the same patient still in the hallway, eating all of his meals in the open corridor. We asked the director of the Manhattan VA, were patients treated in the hallways, even when beds were available?
In terms of that allegation, I think there's a misunderstanding in terms of hallways. When a physician sees a patient, the patient may wait in the hallway, but the actual treatment takes place in privacy and in dignity.
November 18th, 1981. Our Target 7 investigator reports a male patient on the ward calls for help. He pushes the nurse's call button over and over. No one answers. He calls for help again. No answer. Finally, a nurse shows up. The patient's intravenous tube had become dislodged from his arm. He was bleeding profusely. That same day, November 18th, another male patient scheduled for test is paged over the intercom. No response. By day's end, the patient is still missing. One doctor remarked to the nurse who was looking for the patient, "Don't worry about him. This happens all of the time." When our undercover investigator left the hospital that evening, the patient was still missing.
No director would like to say a patient is lost, but I could, in psychiatric institutions with many, many buildings and large, huge grounds, maybe that could happen. But here, it's impossible.
November 18th, 1981, 11 a.m. A male patient is sedated and prepped for tests. Our undercover investigator is there as the patient waits on a stretcher in the hallway. By day's end, the patient is still on the stretcher in the hallway. Our undercover investigator working on the ward is told to take the patient back to his room. No tests were performed. At this point, the patient went into a rage, screaming, "This is the second time you've drugged me and left me in the hallway all day for nothing. I'll never let you do this to me again." In the 2 months our Target 7 undercover investigator worked as a volunteer on a ward at the Manhattan VA, she found that the ward she worked on was overwhelmed and understaffed. As a result, it was common to find both patient and medical charts misplaced or among the missing. The supplies for those patients, like pajamas, blankets, towels, in short supply. Calls for help from patients usually went unanswered, and medication drawers were left open with drugs and medicines left open within easy reach of any passers-by. Storage areas for sterile equipment were filthy. Would you say that your goal here at the Manhattan Veterans Administration Hospital is to provide quality and compassionate care for the people who are in your care?
Yes. Compassionate care, yes. That's the bottom line.
The problem was I could never find a doctor. Or at least if I did get to find a doctor, I could never get the same one twice. While I was at the VA hospital on First Avenue, I had to have my wife come in and bring heating pads because when they gave me a spinal tap, they depressed a disc in my neck. I was carrying my head around for 3 days, physically carrying it around. Head, one hand behind my head and the other one under my chin. Of course, I had to go to x-rays, I had other treatment. And by luck, I was only in there 21 days. The people, the nurses and the other people I dealt with were fantastic. But they can't prescribe unless there's a doctor. And who's your doctor? Well, yesterday it was so-and-so, and tomorrow it might be somebody else. You know, the guy's going to be here at 9 o'clock. But he couldn't make it today. Well, you could die the day after. But then he might make that, make it for that one.
Many of the veterans we interviewed for this series, like Frank Hagee, have found support and counseling at the Queens VA Outreach Center, one of a network of outreach centers growing up across the nation to deal on a more intimate basis with the problems of the veteran. The centers run by veterans themselves have become a way back home for many disillusioned vets. Tomorrow, undercover inside the VA. Roger and Bill.
The Veterans Administration and its hospitals were set up as havens for those who have served and suffered in the service of our country. But many of the veterans find that the Veterans Administration has become, over the years, very little more than a hell for heroes. And so it is that John Johnson continues with the third part of his all-week-long series on the Veterans Administration, his Target 7 investigation. John?
Thank you, Bill. Some critics of the Veterans Administration and its 172 hospitals have characterized the VA as a warehousing operation, an institution on vacation that pays more attention to medical technology than basic health care. For 2 months, Target 7 went undercover to find out just how some VA hospitals really operate.
I'm very bitter. I'm very bitter because me personally, I happen to be in a company that was wiped out completely. They killed 263 men, 18 of us left. I had to treat for 2 days before I saw a first American soldier come in. So I went to St. Albans, trying to get some hospital. Yes, trying to get some psychology help. Mm-hmm. They wanted to give me a bunch of pills, which I was never into pills, so I didn't even take them. So after going about 3 or 4 times, I said, "Y'all think I'm crazy? I'm gonna show you." So I jumped out the window.
Why'd you do that?
I jumped out the second floor window because I was fed up. Once I jumped out the window, I just walked. I gave it up. I don't want to have nothing to do with nothing that says VA.
Tony Hersey, a combat veteran of some of the worst fighting in Vietnam, suffered delayed stress syndrome, the affliction of thousands of Vietnam-era vets, the recurring nightmare battle that can render a man psychologically and physically helpless. Growing numbers of veterans throughout the country are saying, "We fought for democracy, we fought for America," only to come home to a Washington bureaucracy, short on memory and long on red tape. Red tape that has caused veterans literally to have to wait years for proper and adequate medical health care and disability benefits. Red tape, the vets say, begins and ends here in the nation's capital.
Well, as a representative of many veterans organizations, I can tell you that the Vietnam veterans are hardly convinced that the Veterans Administration is acting as their best interest. They see the Veterans Administration as the major obstacle that they have to getting what it is that they want. Well, outside the Veterans Administration, there's a quote by Abraham Lincoln that the solemn obligation is to take care of the widows and the children, and the courts, the few times they've been allowed to look at the Veterans Administration, have always said that in mockery because it's been so obviously absent.
We attract some of the finest medical personnel in the country. As a matter of fact, 2 of our staff have been Nobel Prize winners. It is research by VA clinicians that developed the CAT scanner. I would say that the medical talent that we have in VA hospital is equal to the best anywhere in the world.
Well, at least one of those Nobel Prize winners is right here in the Bronx VA, one of the newest Veterans Administration hospitals in the country, a showcase of medical technology, a hospital that has been criticized, however, by author and investigative reporter Robert Klein. Klein, the author of Wounded Men, Broken Promises, criticizes the VA for focusing on the more exotic while neglecting the more mundane, the health care. For 2 months, the Target 7 undercover investigator worked as a volunteer at the Bronx VA hospital. Using daily diaries, photographs, and a hidden camera, documented these incidents. December 1st, 1981. A male patient on the ward was taken for x-rays with excrement smeared over his pajamas. When the patient was returned to the ward, he was strapped in a chair, left to sit in his own waste. December 3rd, 1981. Our undercover investigator assigned to filing medical records at the Bronx VA discovers many inaccuracies. For instance, one patient who had died on September 13th, 1981, had been ordered for tests the day after his death. Our investigator noted that despite the death of the patient, forms had been filled out saying the test had been completed. Impossible. Yet when our investigator brought the mistake to the attention of the supervisor told our undercover operative, and I quote, "I never worry about that."
You're talking perhaps of isolated instances when you deal with 150,000 outpatient visits and 20,000 inpatient visits.
It's 150,000.
150,000 on the average outpatient visits. I'm sure you can find instances where records are not filed or not kept up because the volume is horrendous.
Well, mistakes in medical records of the dead is one thing, but there have been a lot of problems for the living when trying to get proper medical care at the Bronx VA. Jose Malave is a Vietnam veteran who was treated in the Bronx.
I don't think that my stomach should have been removed at all. But right now, every time I go into the hospital and they see the scar on my stomach, they ask me what have they done to me. And I tell them I had surgery, I had half of my stomach removed. And they ask me why. And I'm not a doctor to tell them why. They did it. They should know why they removed it. I don't. I was in pain, so I let them do it.
Do you believe that complaints like veteran Jose Malave, who said he was misdiagnosed, is rather the exception rather than the rule here at the Bronx VA?
I would say that yes, we make mistakes. Doctors are human. You and I are human. We may miss a diagnosis. We may have an unconcerned physician that is involved in something else. It just doesn't give that person the time and the effort. But that perhaps is one instant out of 999 successes.
Over the 2 months that our Target 7 investigator worked as a volunteer at the Bronx VA, she documented a series of problems at the hospital. Day after day, no linens were available, no pajamas, no blankets. Equipment like wheelchairs and stretchers were broken or impossible to find. Medications were often unaccounted for from one shift to the next. Medical charts were often missing, and patient files were often not up to date and inaccurate. Numerous nurses that didn't speak English well enough to understand a patient, complicating the delivery of medical services to the patients. Our investigator also observed that patient diets were commonly mixed up, whereby a patient who should have received liquids was given solid food, while the reverse was a common occurrence also. Director McCracken, you believe that the Veterans Administration hospitals, this hospital that you're responsible for, is sensitive to the needs of the veteran and has the best intentions of the best medical care for the veterans who come to you for help.
I sure do. It's been in my experience in every facility I've had association with, and I know the facilities in Manhattan and Brooklyn and some of the metropolitan areas, that they do a good job by and large with the veteran population in taking care of his needs and is sensitive compassionate fashion. And I wouldn't be associated with any organization that didn't have this attitude.
People listening to this are going to say, well, why does he keep going back to the Veterans Administration Hospital? If you keep being misdiagnosed and having all these problems, why don't you go someplace else?
The reason I go back is because it's the only hospital we have that is free for the veterans. And the way that the hospital stay, what have you, costs now, it's too much money. I can't afford it.
If there was some way you could go to a private hospital or other hospitals or see private doctors, would you?
I will go to Albert Einstein or Jacobi or what have you. I will not go to the veteran, but I don't have no choice.
According to the National Academy of Sciences and its landmark study of the Veterans Administration hospitals, the Academy concluded that the VA hospital should be merged into community-based facilities, calling the Veterans Administration's Empress Beautiful clothing oversized, unbecoming, and outmoded. Tomorrow, the issue of Agent Orange.
During the Vietnam War, the United States thought they could clear the jungle of Vietnam with an herbicide called Agent Orange. It didn't really work, but Agent Orange has lingered over the years, and John Johnson looks at that tonight in his continuing report on the Veterans Administration Hell for Heroes. John?
Thank you, Bill. Agent Orange, a defoliant used during the Vietnam War, a source of endless controversy. Since 1978, Vietnam vets have been charging that the defoliant is responsible for a host of their medical problems, including cancer and birth defects. But to date, no definitive study by the Veterans Administration has linked Agent Orange with any particular symptoms except for chloracne, a skin condition. Frustrated veterans groups have joined in condemning the VA for dragging its feet, some even accusing it of acting in bad faith.
To all my brothers out there who are Vietnam veterans, who were in Vietnam from 1962 to 1972, I'm dying of cancer right now, and I believe it's because of this Agent Orange that was sprayed over there. If you were going through the foliage over there around the perimeters, or used to see it sprayed, or you were spraying it yourself, get to a doctor, get to the VA, put your claim in, because I don't want to see it happen to anyone. I don't want anyone to go through what I've gone through. I died in Vietnam and didn't even know it.
Within months of this interview I conducted with Paul Rotachan, he died. Rotachan died December 14th, 1978. He was 28 years old. Cause of death, cancer. Rotachan has come to symbolize for thousands of Vietnam combat veterans the issue of Agent Orange, the most controversial and highly emotional issue between the Vietnam veterans, the government, and the Veterans Administration.
It's a battle of economics versus humanity. They simply do not want to pay the compensation. They're not looking at us as people suffering or dying or children born with birth defects. They see us as cases. We're potential money. We're potential millions and millions of dollars every year for an indefinite period of time, and they simply don't want to pay the money. So in the interim, we have to bury the veterans. We have to take care of the children. We have to struggle to survive, to do an overwhelmingly difficult job with a tremendous adversity, and we'll take that responsibility.
Have there been any veterans so far who have received compensation as a result of exposure to Agent Orange?
As far as I'm aware, there are no compensatory cases yet. I'm not ruling out the possibility, because there could be cases of acute chloracne which may have resulted in compensation, but if so, I'm not aware of it.
Agent Orange, a deadly herbicide used in Vietnam to defoliate Viet Cong hiding places by the United States military. Over 5 million acres of Vietnam was sprayed by helicopter and C-123 cargo planes with Agent Orange, a herbicide that contains dioxin. Dioxin, called by scientists the most deadly man-made toxic substance to date. Dioxin so toxic that a few ounces strategically placed could wipe out the population of New York City. Bowing to pressure, the United States stopped spraying Agent Orange in Vietnam in 1970, while it was still being used here in the United States, unbeknownst to most of us, until 1979. The Environmental Protection Agency getting only a temporary ban on the herbicide, even though labeling it a cancer-causing agent.
The present and recent past administrations of the Veterans Administration have turned their back on the Vietnam combat veteran. They have ignored an enormous body of scientific literature that clearly points out that at least one of the toxic substances to which all the veterans in Vietnam were exposed, dioxin, the contaminant of Agent Orange, is capable of producing cancer and other serious, damaging, long-term physiological effects.
For many veterans, the enemy they fought in the jungles of Vietnam wasn't just the Viet Cong. It was also the herbicides, the pesticides, Agent Orange, sprayed by their own countrymen. Now those same Vietnam veterans say they have a new enemy. An enemy not in the jungles of Vietnam, but right here in the corridors and hallways of Washington.
The dilemma evolves into two fundamental questions. The first is whether a veteran was exposed to Agent Orange, and second, what are the effects of that exposure? The VA in April of 1980 resolved the first question by presuming that a veteran who served in Vietnam was exposed to Agent Orange. This was prompted by the lack of any practical method of distinguishing between individuals who were exposed and those who were not. Unfortunately, the second question is not so easily answered.
While the Veterans Administration admits that those who served in Vietnam were exposed to Agent Orange, the VA has thus far not admitted that exposure to Agent Orange is correlated with cancer, birth defects in children, or psychological problems. They claim that scientific knowledge is still inadequate to make those correlations. While the VA has been unable to even design the study to seek out evidence of those potential correlations, the Federal Food and Drug Administration has already estimated that dioxin, the toxic substance in Agent Orange, is 100,000 to 1 million times more potent than thalidomide in causing birth defects among children of people exposed to it. Jim Lutz, a Vietnam veteran, has suffered many medical maladies since he left Vietnam. But his greatest concern is for his 4 children, all of whom have birth defects. He and his wife blame their children's birth defects and Jim's illnesses on his exposure to Agent Orange.
When I first come home, I had a lot of stomach problems, a lot of chloracne all over my back, nausea, fatigue, forgetfulness. I noticed a cyst on my neck when I first got out, on my right side of my neck. Several years after, I got a cyst on my base of my spine. I've had them removed since that.
Have your children had any problems?
Yes, my son had 40-something ear infections before he was 4 years old. He complains of stomach problems off and on himself. Christine was born with bilateral hip dysplasia, and Jessica suffers from a minor seizure disorders she has.
She's in a special education preschool at United Cerebral Palsy School in Comac because she was having speech problems, and she has other scattered developmental delays.
So all of the children have exhibited some form of problem, and you believe that is a direct result of your husband being exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam?
I definitely do. There's too many veterans across the country, in Australia, in the United States, in Korea, in New Zealand, whose children are all suffering similar problems.
Target 7 was at the Senate oversight hearings on Agent Orange in Washington last November, when an outraged Pennsylvania senator, all-inspector, was demanding from the Veterans Administration's director and his chief medical expert answers on Agent Orange.
How long will the studies take to determine whether there is a cause and effect relationship between exposure to dioxin, Agent Orange, and the rashes and tumors and cancers and genetic defects which we have heard so much about?
The study will probably be in keeping with other generally similar types of studies, that there will not be a single point in time in which we'll have all the answers.
You say there's not a single point in time when we will have all the answers.
Yes, sir.
25 years?
Hopefully by then we should, yes.
Well, that's not acceptable. Are you in a position to give me an estimate as to how long it will be before we know the answer to the causal connection between exposure to Agent Orange and birth defects?
It's my understanding that we should have some of those answers by the middle of 1983.
There are those who say the VA doesn't want to make any of those findings because of money. the millions upon millions of dollars that would have to be paid to expose veterans and their families as compensation for the results of that exposure.
What is the estimate of cost if Agent Orange is found to be the causative factor of the Chamber of Horrors, which we have heard about from so many people in this country?
We are indeed would be looking at hundreds of millions of dollars going into probably the middle of the next century.
While the issue of Agent Orange is being debated in the august halls of Washington, there are those across this land in cities large and small who served in Vietnam, who believe that they are now suffering the effects of exposure to the deadly herbicide. Veterans who believe that their children are suffering the effects of their exposure. Veterans who believe that the enormous suicide rate, over 50,000 Vietnam-era vets have committed suicide, is attributable to the psychological disorders caused by exposure to dioxin.
They're going to be dying at twice the rate here in the States as they were actually dying in combat. 21 Vietnam veterans every day die. They blow their brains out. They're dying of young men's old men's cancers. They're dying from various types of psychological problems and suicides. And this is going to continue. And as far as we're concerned, we're going to do everything within our power to stop it.
While Frank McCarthy and other veterans continue their battle against the Veterans Administration and its Agent Orange policies, the government just continues to plod along. Since Target 7 attended those Senate hearings in Washington last November, nothing new has happened. The study on the effects of exposure to Agent Orange, mandated by Congress in 1979, is still no closer to being completed. In fact, it is yet to begin. Tomorrow, Guinea Pig Experiments and the Veterans Administration.
There are men who have served in the military who harbor deep complaints against the Veterans Administration. To some of them, the VA is a hell for heroes. John Johnson has been telling us about some of those men this week. And tonight, as he concludes his special report, he takes a look at men used in experiments during their service.
Right, Bill. Thank you. In a 1981 survey, or check by U.S. News and World Report on the Veterans Administration's hospital, a wide variety of complaints against the VA were revealed. One of the major complaint areas was the use of VA patients as medical guinea pigs. In Chicago, for instance, a landmark suit has been filed against the VA's North Chicago Medical Center, objecting to the practice of VA experimentation. Tonight, we have a story.
This particular general asked me if I would volunteer. And I asked him if it involved needles, and he said, yes, it did, and I detest needles. And I said, no, sir, I'd rather not. And then he point blank told me that he could certainly make me wish I had. And that obviously changed my mind right then.
So what you're saying then is, basically, Jerry, is that you went into the experiment under duress.
Absolutely. I certainly would have never done it if I'd had a free choice about it.
His name is Jerry Teedy, an all-around guy, athlete in school, an Air Force volunteer. Teedy wanted to do a job for his country. Today, Jerry Teedy is a disillusioned young man.
Well, Jerry, are you bitter?
I'm a little bitter, but it's nothing more than I expected. I really didn't feel the VA would do justice to anybody. They'll make the easy decision, or one that won't make any waves, but anything further than that, anything unusual or out of the ordinary, they're just going to bury under the carpet and hope it goes away. And normally it will.
While in the Air Force, Jerry Teedy took part in military experiments. He was used as a guinea pig. The top-secret experiments call for Teedy to be strapped on this stretcher for 3 solid months, sometimes hanging vertically, sometimes suspended horizontally, most of the time in severe pain. The experiment to determine the effects of prolonged weightlessness.
During the course of the experiment, they called in a neurologist because they found they'd pinched nerves due to the straps on the tilt table. He told the doctor in charge of the experiment that the only way to correct my particular problem was to back off the experiment for a little bit and let my nerves heal themselves. But being the experiment had to be done in a certain time frame, and they would have had to start all over again had they done that, they decided not to. And I had to continue with the pinched nerves, and it was extremely painful. But perhaps I'm more patriotic than good sense would allow at times.
Today, Jerry Teedy suffers nerve damage to his legs that he blames on the experiments. He has been told that ultimately he might lose the use of his legs. He has been denied any VA benefits. In fact, the VA initially refused to admit that Teedy ever participated in any experiments. They later admitted that he had been used as a guinea pig, but still denied his appeal for VA compensation. Well, why wouldn't the Veterans Administration want to compensate you if you were involved in this experiment and were permanently damaged?
Well, I believe they'd be opening a basket of worms if they did. That's probably their opinion. I suppose that's why they won't give me any compensation. I certainly wasn't the only one experimented with, and I don't think that they want to open that up.
Ron Simon is the general counsel to the Washington-based National Veterans Law Center, representing thousands of veterans in their claims against the Veterans Administration. He is also representing Jerry Teedy.
Here's Mr. Teedy. He's had this problem for years, and there are many other veterans. There are 30 million veterans in the United States who be in possibly a similar situation. The problem is, if they lose their case at the VA, there is no place they can go. Unlike other citizens, they cannot contest the decision of an agency in court. Any other citizen, whether he or she be in federal prison, whether they want to get into Little League, whether they have some disagreement about their grades in algebra, these citizens can go to court if they have a disagreement. Veterans are the only class of citizens that can't. They can neither sue the military, nor can they sue the VA.
Cases like Jerry Teedy and other veterans that we met earlier in these reports begged for clarification from the director of the Veterans Administration. So did questions raised in this series, even by a United States Senator, over the so-called foot-dragging of the VA and finding some answers about Agent Orange. We went to Washington again for those answers. At our first encounter with the director of the Veterans Administration, access was easy and friendly. But as Target 7's investigation into the Veterans Administration moved forward, things began to change. At one point, a spokesman for the VA called Eyewitness News, warning that the VA knew that Target 7 was carrying on an investigation. He also warned that they didn't like our tactics. He also said that they were going to get in touch with the chairman of the board of ABC. Not only that, request after request for a follow-up interview with the director of the Veterans Administration was first put off, then delayed, then abruptly canceled when we came here to Washington, D.C. During the few minutes I was outside the Veterans Administration, a man who later identified himself as an employee of the VA watched and listened as I reported my inability to get to interview the director. He turned out to be yet another VA employee dissatisfied with Target 7 and our persistence. Well, how many times? We had called for quite some time, sir. And then there was no refusal. Why did the refusal only come after we were already here in Washington? You could have told us that in New York.
We called you the day before you came down.
Sir,
we never got the message.
Sir, we have a tape recorder on our phone. There was no message on our recorder on our phone. Nobody told us that. But not only that, we even called after that, and there was no refusal. The refusal only came after we were already down here in Washington. I mean, you could have told us in New York that
we called your New York office and told you he wasn't available.
We never. But you mean it took you? It took you more than a week to find out that the director of the Veterans Administration.
I wasn't even handling it. I was just sitting next to the men doing it, and every effort was made to get you an interview. I can tell you that.
But we had the refusal once we got to Washington. I mean, it just.
The man doesn't have enough hours in his schedule to suit you. I'm sorry. I'm not the administrator. I don't make up his schedule.
Okay. Well, thanks. What is your name, sir?
John Hickman.
Thank you. Obviously, we were never able to speak with the director of the Veterans Administration or his aides. We were never able to ask about conditions in some of the VA hospitals. We were never able to ask why it took Peter Sabia more than 2 years to get compensation for testicular cancer. We were never able to ask why the Veterans Administration had not moved more swiftly in resolving the Agent Orange controversy. We were never able to ask why veterans who had participated in experiments as guinea pigs were denied disability compensation. We were never able to ask why growing numbers of veterans refused to go to VA hospitals because of poor medical care. We were never able to ask why the National Academy of Sciences called for the ultimate elimination of VA hospitals into community-based facilities. Perhaps the answer to the lack of answers from the VA is somewhere here in this quote from the New England Journal of Medicine. I quote, "The fact is that the VA medical care system is a sacred cow.
the whole subject so loaded with political emotion and vested interest that rational public discourse is hardly possible. Yet the need for dispassionate inquiry into the VA is palpable and grows ever more pressing." End quote.
I think that the maintenance of a separate medical care system for veterans, as opposed to a medical care system for the rest of the American people, is inappropriate. The other alternative is to convert the veterans' hospitals to community hospitals. Let them maintain community hospital standards, which are now much higher than veterans' hospital standards, and fully utilize the facilities there. One or the other of those choices must be made by Congress, because the present state is intolerable. It cannot continue. Now the system is dying. It either has to be revitalized from the top down, or it's got to be interred gracefully.
The complaints against the Veterans Administration that Target 7 has pointed up in this series of reports has been echoed by other independent checks of the VA healthcare system. U.S. News and World Report, for instance, concluded that complaints most frequently heard against the VA are insensitivity to the needs of the veterans, abusive care of many patients, too much medical experimentation on vets, understaffing of VA hospitals, and an overuse of drugs on patients. The complaints and allegations against the VA warrant, according to even some experienced VA hospital administrators, some real solutions, and perhaps some scrutiny of the VA by Congress. After all, it was Congress itself that charged the VA with the care of him who has borne the battle for his widow and his orphan.